Hello, welcome to my talk about well-being as need satisfaction, a new theory of well-being based on a new analysis of the concept of need, or in particular, a special kind of need that isn't merely instrumental. But I'll get on to what that is soon. First, already on an intuitive understanding of need, a need satisfaction view would differ from standard offerings, such as the three options on Derek Parfit's commonly recognized taxonomy of well-being theories. Intuitively, needing something differs from receiving positive states of consciousness from it, a la hedonism. It's also, at least not obviously, just the same as attaining intrinsically valuable goods, of the kind that objective list theories say well-being consists in. Needing something is also different from getting what you desire. This is because intuitively you can need what you don't want, and you can fail to need what you do want. And the same holds true of satisfying other intentional attitudes that some have more recently argued well-being consists in. So need satisfaction isn't among the theories of well-being philosophers commonly defend. But you might already be thinking that that is no surprise. Needs might already seem an utterly unpromising basis for a theory of well-being, a total non-starter. This would likely be because, on the one hand, philosophers commonly agree that well-being is something that is of final value, something that it's good for a person to have for its own sake. Needs, on the other hand, are often understood to be valuable only ever insofar as they're necessary for some further end. And so, many think that needs come in at most two types. First, there are purely instrumental needs, that is, necessary means to or preconditions for further contingent ends. By definition, meeting conditions that are merely instrumentally necessary doesn't realize final value. Second, basic needs, or basic human needs, are sometimes also recognized. These are things that ostensibly all people need, just in virtue of being human. So a person's needing basic needs isn't contingent on their particular aims or good. Even so, it might seem that there's still a further end that basic needs are necessary for, some state of proper human functioning. So both instrumental needs and basic needs seem to be only ever necessary preconditions for a person to enjoy well-being. And if this is so, it seems doubtful that meeting needs could constitute well-being itself. I defend needs that are neither instrumental nor basic needs understood in these ways, but rather a third sort, categorical needs. Various terms for these needs are used, but I stick with categorical. What's distinctive about categorical needs is that their value, their necessity, isn't hypothetical upon some further end they serve. They are goods necessary for a person to have for their own sake, finally necessary ends or goods, that is, final ends or final goods which are not only good, but also necessary for the person who has the needs to attain. The type of categorical needs typically defended ostensibly appear in moral discourse, and which I term essentially moralised needs. These needs are purportedly interests to which every person has a moral claim or claim of justice to have satisfied or protected. I'm going to define these more precisely soon, but for a rough characterization, they're in a way similar to basic needs, only they're heavily moralised. These needs are specific things that people are owed. They're often defined in the first instance as the necessary conditions for a person to avoid being harmed, a moralised concept, where it's necessary to avoid harming and avoiding harm to oneself for its own sake. Several proponents of these needs follow Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations in defining a person's necessaries as the minimum requirements for maintaining a living standard that society considers decent, and where a person is harmed if they don't manage to meet that standard. Notice that essentially moralised needs aren't supposed to be elements of well-being exactly, rather as part of what moral obligation or just minimum provision involves. I'm not interested in defending or rejecting the existence of these essentially moralised categorical needs, but what I do reject is the idea that these are the only possible kind of categorical needs, which is what their proponents tend to claim. I argue that both essentially moralised needs and the different categorical needs I'll go on to defend are each species of a more general concept of categorical need. In my analysis of this general concept, it has what I call a modular structure. Here I'm actually adapting Ingrid Robain's modular classification of specific capabilities theories as being part of a general theoretical approach, the capability approach to human development. I'm proposing that there may also be general concepts that contain specific varieties that differ in a similar way. And in this way, there are A modules and B modules. A modules are conditions that are essential to the concept and have fixed content. B modules are conditions that are likewise essential to the concept, but their content is open to different specifications. Robain's also employs certain C modules, but I won't do that here. Here are the A modules of the general concept of categorical need. First, A1, final. Categorical needs are conditions that it's finally necessary for the person who has them to fulfill. A2, real. There's a fact of the matter about what a person categorically needs, independent of the person's actually, presently apprehending them. Finally, A3, inescapable. A person's categorical needs aren't subject to their will, in that a person can't simply decide what they do and they do not need. And now here are the general articulations of the B modules, which specific variant concepts specify differently. First, whatever else the categorical needs in question are like, they'll have to correspond to or derive from normative reasons of some kind. Similarly, they'll be shared across persons to some greater or lesser extent. And finally, the needs will correspond to some more or less expansive or minimal extent of attainment. Now here's how essentially moralised needs specify the B modules. So B star moral, B1 star moral. If a person lacks an essentially moralised need, then others are pro tanto obligated to assist them in attaining it. Moreover, persons' essentially moralised needs extend only so far as the conditions others are pro tanto obligated to ensure they can attain. B2 star universal. Essentially moralised needs are necessary for human persons as such, at least within some society, and hence are shared universally by such persons, at least within that society. B3 star minimal. Essentially moralised needs correspond to a relatively minimal standard of living. By contrast to these conditions, the personal needs I defend specify the general concepts B modules differently. These modules plus the A modules form the definition of a personal need. B1 star star practical. Personal needs are practical requirements on a person, entailed by commitments that matter to them personally. These aren't necessarily moral commitments, and neither are personal needs necessarily conditions that other people are morally required to help a person to satisfy. B2 star star particular. Personal needs are particular to individual persons, since other people will share these needs, that is, be practically compelled in the same ways, if and only if they have the same commitments. B3 star star expansive. Fulfilling personal needs is a major part of the well-being of persons who have them. I'll discuss what exactly all this means shortly, but already both defenders and opponents of categorical needs might be unhappy with the bare idea that needs could be personal. How can personal needs really be necessary? Although we're familiar with moral necessity, how could there be non-moral necessary normative requirements on an individual person, generated simply by what matters to them personally? The question can be interpreted as demanding how these specifications could possibly be compatible with categorical needs A modules, final, real, and inescapable. Let's work backwards from A3, inescapable, which stated that a person's categorical needs aren't subject to their will. One reason for skepticism about personal needs here may be the thought that people have too much control over ends that matter to them personally. A skeptic might allow that persons do indeed need various things in order to attain their personal ends, that is, instrumentally, but also think that people choose for themselves which ends those are. As Harry Frankfurt puts the thought, although a person may need the object since it is indispensable to an end that he desires, his need for it is his own concoction. Ends that personally matter to people, on this view, can neither constitute nor entail categorical needs, because those ends are contingent on the person's willing them to matter to themselves. And ultimately, an instrumental necessity is only as necessary as the purpose it serves. However, it's a mistake to think that the things that matter most to people are restricted to intentionally adopted and freely dispensable aims, goals, and projects. People often find themselves with allegiances and under demands they haven't chosen but nevertheless can't deny. In a special sense of the term, many persons also have commitments, which are personal engagements that are or become out of their control, and which they can't rid themselves of at will. Examples of such engagements that are commitments for some people include special roles, certain projects, ideals, religious and cultural traditions, identities, relationships with family, friends and partners, communities and so on, causes and vocations. In some cases, a person might not have chosen to have some commitment. In other cases, a commitment may start out as an intentionally or arbitrarily chosen engagement, only subsequently becoming inescapable, once it's got a grip on the person, so to speak. Moreover, even ostensibly chosen commitments can sometimes seem thrust upon us, as if, as James Griffin puts a similar idea, they choose us. What exactly do commitments have to do with personal needs again? Well, recall that personal needs are defined as the practical requirements on a person that having certain commitments entails. Having a commitment, then, just is to be under certain demands. There are a number of things that the person with a commitment needs to do if they are to live up to it. Evidence for commitments is, as in Griffin's observation, phenomenological. A person can perceive a commitment in the vivid sense that they must take some course of action, an awareness that it's somehow demanded of them. Importantly, this experience of being constrained isn't merely psychological, an unreasoned, brute urge or overwhelming aversion the person feels. Its compulsion has a normative aspect, the person acknowledging it as having an authority over themselves, as reflecting a truth about what they, in particular and there and then, should or should not do. Bernard Williams and Harry Frankfurt have called similar experiences practical necessity and volitional necessity. I don't claim that such sensations are infallible, only that veridical experiences of practical necessity are perceptions of one's commitments. As well as showing how personal needs fill out the inescapability A module, this account of commitments and personal needs shows how they fill out module A2, real. This is just because a person doesn't necessarily know which commitments they have. Which those are is something a person may learn about themselves and may forget. The experience of practical necessity can be a revelation or a powerful reminder. The last A module to deal with is A1, final. This one might seem difficult, since while that condition requires that a categorical need is necessary for its own sake, my suggestion appears to be that personal needs are necessary for the sake of living up to one's commitments. Actually, I dropped a hint about how it makes sense a few slides back, but to make it explicit, the explanation involves observing that there's more than one necessary for the sake of relation. The most familiar variety is, of course, where something is a necessary means or precondition for the sake of a further end, that is, instrumental necessity. If commitments were just further ends that personal needs were necessary for, then it's true, personal needs would fail to be categorical. However, another necessary for the sake of relation is constitutive necessity, where something is a necessary part of some whole, such that the whole can't exist, as the kind of thing it essentially is, without incorporating that part along with all of its necessary parts, the other necessary parts. It's in this respect that fulfilling a personal need is done for the sake of living up to its corresponding commitment. It's constitutive of living up to that commitment that the person fulfills all of the personal needs the commitment entails. And here's the link to well-being. The central aspects of some people's well-being, of what their living well essentially consists in, is their living up to the commitments that they have. There's another instance of constitutive necessity here, in that a person's living up to their commitments is done for the sake of their well-being, of their living a good life with respect to what matters to them, but not where well-being is a further end. On this account, what constitutes the essential part of well-being just is the person's living up to their commitments. Involving personal needs and commitments in well-being has a number of significant theoretical consequences, though I won't be able to go into them in any detail in this talk. Here are three very briefly before I move on to the consequence that I consider most important, and which is the basic motivation for the account. First, well-being as need satisfaction provides a distinctive explanation for why some elements or aspects of people's well-being may be especially or centrally important. And this is just because those elements are essential to their lives going well. Other non-central aspects, on my view, those not related to a person's commitments and personal needs, are not essential. Second, my account combines attractive aspects of some other competing theories of well-being. Like desire theories, it allows that some aspects of well-being can be subject-dependent, that is, vary from person to person. But it explains this differently, in terms of different people having different commitments. The account also holds that some aspects of well-being are to some extent objective, in that, as per condition A2, real, there are truths about a person's well-being that aren't dependent on what the person wants or believes it to be. Third, my account can be used to define a fundamentally qualitatively distinct state of sufficiency, of what it is for a person to have enough at a personal level, namely when a person has, or more importantly is doing, everything they need, when they're living up to all of their commitments. There's a great deal that has to be said about each of these implications of the account, and I do discuss them at length in the paper. I want to use the remaining time to present the implication that I think is most significant. This is the deep challenge the account presents to the intrapersonal aggregation and trading off of people's interests. That is the aggregation of interests even in the one-person case, even before we get to the interpersonal aggregation of multiple persons' interests. This challenge owes to the fact that needs are non-substitutable. That's part of the logic of necessity. Some n is necessary for the fulfillment of some condition C, if and only if n can't be replaced if C is to be fulfilled. Personal needs non-substitutability is twofold. First, their satisfaction can't be substituted in value by non-needs. No amount of non-necessary goods can compensate for the non-fulfillment of a personal need, for failing to live up to a commitment. Second, neither can satisfying personal needs be substituted in value by each other. That is, personal needs are severally necessary, not necessary as a category or group. This is because the value, the necessity of each commitment, isn't contingent on its contribution to any further end than that is separate from itself. Analogous to the so-called separateness of persons, there's here a sort of separateness of central interests. As such, there isn't any commensurating value available, in terms of which living up to a commitment might be traded off and compensated by another. There's a lot more to be said about this, especially technical objections to answer, which I do in the paper, but instead of going deep into that, I'll conclude with some of the practical upshots of this part of well-being as need satisfaction. The main point is that this theory of well-being undercuts any moral or political theory that relies on the intrapersonal aggregation of interests being entirely unproblematic. It does away with the idea that well-being is structurally just like utility, a sort of homogeneous stuff that can be adequately represented simply by qualitatively undifferentiated magnitudes, by levels on a common scale. In the account I propose, well-being is something much more fragmented than that. And this is realistic, I think, because it's sensitive to the existence of costs and harms that can't simply be recouped by gains of different kinds, no matter how large. Personal needs and commitments help to render claims to have interests like that intelligible, and not symptoms of practical irrationality, as they might otherwise be supposed. It also provides a micro-level explanation for macro-level claims about well-being pluralism in political philosophy and the social sciences. The obvious objection to all this, of course, is that such irreducible plurality threatens to be practically crippling. How does decision-making proceed? Yet this is only an objection to the account if commensuration and aggregation are essential to rational choice, and that's disputable. Even so, I do fully own that the ultimate success of well-being as need satisfaction depends on uncovering non-aggregating modes of deliberation and practical reasoning, and showing how they play out in moral and political contexts. These will necessarily be more complicated than simple sum maximization, and I'm pursuing this in further research. I have to end here, but thanks for watching. Please comment or get in touch if you have any questions or thoughts to add. Thanks.